two microphones going on, and thank you very much, Usman, for your wonderful lecture, and especially for illustrating everything with case studies, because it gets an immediate understanding of the theory and philosophy behind it. So you are all welcome to.
Hi. I was wondering, actually, I think it's really nice that you, not just nice, I think it's actually really valuable that you explore different kind of crises as they emerge in society and as they start to take more and more power over individuals' lives, as in, like lack of that, what we call democracy is actually not democracy, or participation as in that there's a lot of illusions of participation, and that maybe through engaging people differently we can come up with ways of challenging existing models. One thing that I wonder though is why, or whether you've looked at economic systems and like economic crisis, because if we talk about democracy as a failing mechanism, shouldn't we also talk about capitalism as a failing structure?
Yeah, there was actually a slide I took out. I wonder if I could just pull this up, because this was specifically about, let me just see where that was. In an earlier one, this. Our the debt that capitalism has generated is absolutely massive right now. Our financial systems, just like our technological systems, are really close to collapse. I mean, this was actually from the US Federal Reserve, this graph, where, this kind of combination of global, credit market debt, combined with tax evasion that's going on, combined with basically cryptocurrencies that are kind of undermining all of this. I think it's really vital to understand that that's intersecting with everything that's coming along. I actually don't know what to even do with any of that, which is part of the reason that I'd kind of left out this slide, because I actually don't know what to say. I mean, that is a train that is coming right at us, no matter what we do. There's like absolutely nothing we can do, whether you look at pensions, whether you look at domestic spending, whether you look at, anything to do with the future of anything to do with money. Our kind of liberal democracy and capitalist processes have formed this this kind of that ethics problem of the rail, the train on the tracks, and you got to decide whether to kill 5 people or only 10, or that's it. Sorry, I can't say any more.
It's very illustrative.
I did say it was going to be a bit bleak. That's one of the ones I took out because it was just a bit too bleak.
Thanks for saying it now, at least.
We have another question here.
I have a question. Thank you for the very interesting presentation. What I noticed is in all your projects, almost, you have a technical failure. And you talk of failure, and I was wondering, can it also be embraced as something that you can use, the failure? And one more question that I had is, how do you, isn't it an illusion to think that maintenance is not necessary? Like you said, at some point, maybe I won't need anymore to come there to have maintenance. And I think it's actually really part of working with digital technologies.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. So part of the reason I focused on failure is I think because often when people talk about technology, it's usually about all the success of it. So that's part of the reason. But the second thing is that actually genuinely a lot of stuff just does fail in implementation. So the way we work right now, and in the last few projects where I think I talked less about the technical failure, is kind of interesting. I mean, this borrows very much from the software industry, which is that you spend way more time building tests and kind of structures of evaluation right at the beginning of the project. Before you've even written a line of code or built anything, you actually design all the tests that you're going to do on the thing itself. And that takes up, I would say, 70% of the work. Then the 30% where you actually, build something or what have you, just essentially has to kind of conform to those tests, to those tests. But and so the kind of the failure diminishes, except that you never include for every test. I mean, that's the kind of the it's interesting because that gets into, I think, a whole conversation about the Enlightenment project. I mean, I can really connect this if you want to, which is this kind of desire to know and calculate and plan for everything, and that if we only knew everything in the universe, we could make the best decisions and what have you. So all of which is to say, I've kind of come to the realization that actually, as much as technical failure is a kind of a bit of a burden and a problem, actually very often it also it's part of the process. It kind of has to be, in order to kind of lead to the kind of unexpected things that you take away. So, in a very practical terms, very often our failures in one project become a project as something else. A case in point being Patch Bay, led to kind of Thinkful.
May I? Okay. Usman, excellent lecture. You started with one of the first slides was images of the disaster of Brexit and also the much more recent shock election of a neo-Nazi to the White House. And you talked about the outside, the present and the bleak future within which all this work is operating, which is a slightly unconventional move within a design conference, I think. And if I could connect it with one of the things you was presenting, when you were presenting the Pachube project, and you were talking about Fukushima, you used two phrases. One was the worry that it was dirty data, i.e. data produced by people who are non-experts. And then later you said that one of the shortcomings of the project was that Pachube could never really be used by non-experts, right? So going back to your slide, you feel that these projects can be more successful when more and more people can use it, and without instructions, or that they can self-sustain. Then if I can connect it back to the crisis of democracy that everybody's talking about, one of the surprising revelations in the American elections, among much other analysis that's been happening, of course, and just by way of disclaimer, it's my first American election that I voted in, so I certainly see that result as a kick in the mouth for many of us that are new American citizens. But one of the things that was brought out is that the data analysis operation that the Trump team had was apparently shockingly wide and efficient, which is one of those things that goes against conventional wisdom, which you never heard of before the elections. Then the second thing is when the boycott lists are starting to be produced now of who to boycott. One of the companies on the list is PayPal. And then you find out that Peter Thiel, who's one of his backers, is co-founder, et cetera, et cetera. And I've been having these conversations with liberal left circles where there's this shock that technology companies or technology projects or data analysis itself is being taken over by the right. Because there's almost a belief that it's always going to be libertarians who'll be better at data, or if you open up the door and it's available to everybody, i.e. blogs and internet and Facebook, that it will be majority libertarian, left, progressive, which I think also harkens back to what people think of the early days of the internet. And all sorts of things are happening now that is showing us that technology is not agnostic in that way, that it's available to everybody, and sometimes the right is maybe just as good. So I'm just wondering, also going back to your projects, one project where I thought this directly is when you were showing the project where people are communicating through the Windows, the voiceover project. And just, I think because of events, I immediately started thinking, what if it was really successful, but one of the people who took it over were people who wanted to broadcast, just for sake of provocation, racist messages towards their neighbors, and suddenly they do it really efficiently, and then you have to go and shut down your project because it's been taken over by the wrong kind of people. But I think this idea of wrong kind, right kind also comes from our fundamental belief that technology, when available to the lowest common denominator, will always be going towards a progressive cause. I think recent events really make us pause about that. So just like to hear more from you about that.
That's actually a really good point. Coming back to the patch bay part of the question first, just to comment on that. One of the things I took away from that whole process, and the reason I talked about a little bit about non-experts, is that I think that it emerged at a time where the idea of making data public was really, it was quite a common thing to do, and in a sense, patch bay was very good at that, and it was kind of often put forward as the kind of as a good example of that. And what I realized through that period was actually that the making data public was not the important part. It was the public making data that was most important. And actually, for all that governments are now kind of, conceding that they have to open data and blah, 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 and, for transparency reasons, I think that's wonderful. Actually getting people themselves, like ordinary people, involved in the process of deciding what to measure, where to measure, why to measure it, what decision are they making, what are the standards of evidence upon which they're going to be making those decisions, that happens almost nowhere, right? That just doesn't happen. And so it's almost like the open data push has been able to kind of take the pressure off of actually doing something meaningful, which is getting people involved in that measurement process to begin with. Hence, the reason that we eventually had Thinkful was this idea of thinking, okay, there's now thousands of platforms. Actually, the thing that's needed is the capacity to deal with heterogeneous data, not to standardize everything, but to build tools on top of this kind of heterogeneity and to kind of embrace that heterogeneity. I don't think we do it, incredibly well yet, but that's definitely the kind of whole point. Now, with respect to the kind of the ownership, the idea that an infrastructure might be kind of taken over by, let's say, right or wrong. In a sense, we saw that reveal itself during the project in that whole discussion about, this should or should not be political, and it should or should not be religious. And this is where it gets really interesting to me, because I think that there has been, historically, an idea that we all have to come to consensus, that this is what it's that this is what it should be used for. And a lot of the kind of participatory practice, perhaps going back 20 or 30 years, might have been about making sure we're all on the same page, and the kind of idea of design by committee, if you want to take it to its extreme in the architecture world. And I think that what we're seeing more of now, and certainly what I try to embrace in this thing is, actually we don't need to agree on everything in order to kind of deploy this infrastructure. And so long as you have the basis for at least accepting that you are taking on the governance of this, and you are deciding what censorship constitutes and how that manifests itself, I as the designer, actually, I'm not going to make that decision to shut it down or to do something with it, or what have you. At least not until you invite me back to say, to be part of that conversation. Actually, that really is something that you have to make sense of. And that's why in the technology industry, notwithstanding everything that's going on with PayPal and Peter Thiel and henchmen alike, it's been actually really gratifying to see this kind of move by technology, at least players, maybe not the companies yet, but basically say, look, we need to prepare for January 20th, and that means making sure you're not storing the wrong kind of data that might be used against people. That means changing your system architecture so that people can't be tracked and what have you. And I think that if anything has changed since the election, of course, it's the fact that we're actually discussing this in a real practical sense now. Discussing things like fascism, things like repression and security infrastructure in real pragmatic, practical terms now. So that's the kind of thing that I hold on to. For sure, technology is explicitly bound up in social and even environmental parameters. But that's not necessarily something that means that we can just, that we should just accede to the alt-right / neo-Nazi movement.
Yeah.
Thanks, Usman. That was an absolutely fantastic lecture. I think every architect and designer should hear it. I especially enjoyed your critique of technology. And I think with this sort of fetishization that's going on of parametrics, and seems to continue on into more frightening forms daily, I think what you were saying about technology being a kind of release from responsibility is actually really important, or somehow standing in place for responsibility. So I think for me the critique of technology is really key. I mean, I've really always respect your astute critical thinking and political awareness, and also your real eloquence to put things into these beautiful phrases. The shared memory of a possible future, I'm going to be quoting you on that. That's just says it all, it's beautiful. But what I really wanted to kind of put focus on was, all these things that you're describing: climate change, the debt crisis, rise of fascism, these kinds of contexts that we're in now, and particularly maybe around climate change, that one of the really difficult things there with kind of activist work is that often people really don't want to know about how bleak it is, or even this question of, even if they know, the data isn't enough to change behaviour, and then quite often the behavioural change gets described in very deterministic ways coming out of psychology and so forth, which I find quite problematic. So what I really love about your work is the joy. There's something really joyful about what you do and really affirmative, and I just want to know how you keep the joy.
Oh. I don't have a good answer for that, because actually I mean, some of my friends in the audience know that I've been feeling quite bleak recently about stuff, but I can't tell you how amazing it's been, although I haven't been at this event, but to see how much serious discussion has actually been had about all of these issues, about the way we're going to do this kind of thing. I mean, it really is gratifying. It's put me in such a better mood just to be seeing the stuff that's being discussed. And I'm not just saying that to kind of, gratify the audience. I mean, it's the point is that, as designers, we sometimes almost feel like we're almost like, just humming in the desert, and there's nobody around. And so the most important thing is to suddenly find that actually, yeah, there are other people that care about this, that actually, sometimes, like when I don't really feel, because I'm not feeling that joyful right now, I'm not actually doing very good work, I don't think, over these last couple of months, frankly. But it's really nice to see that other good work is kind of coming out, and you kind of like need to, you kind of remember that, okay, it'll come back and it'll be there. In very practical terms, though, to talk about the past work, I mean, this sounds really cheesy, but very often these things are kind of like just like kernels in a dream that I just wake up to. I mean, I literally wake up. Burble started, I woke up and I was like, oh, I've got to build this thing that I just kind of had this odd dream about, and then that morning went down into my garden and started building this thing. Similarly, with Patch Bay, it was this kind of silly idea, and then actually building it. And so I think, if I want to say something very very kind of practical about it, it's about actually acting on the impulse, kind of almost immediately, because I don't think that ideas matter very much at all. Like I don't subscribe to the idea of there being really good ideas and bad ideas, and especially when I talk to students, it's not like, oh, that's a great idea. I'm really concerned with what do you actually do with that? Like, how do you build that? How do you put it into the world? And how do you enable other people to start to critique it? And I'm constantly trying to compress that. Almost every project is trying to compress that time from kind of the design to the implementation. Ideally should be the same thing. It should be sort of happening at the same time. So I think it's less about joy and perhaps more about this kind of spontaneity of making. And sometimes that just happens to be kind of joyful.
We were going to take the last question of this session, so please.
So my question would be that I'm working in both worlds. So 12 years sitting endless climate change conferences and as an environmental activist and working for the government, and I know that a lot of people who actually have a lot of power to change things are investing in 100 smart cities in India and in, you know, African countries, South America, and so on. While not just floods, but the fact that business as usual, you know, will be really reaching 3.5, 4 degrees, and in 10 years, 12 years, 15 years will be really serious problems, which is not just about floods, but national security and hordes of people, and, you know. So I guess my question is, have you thought of any tools how you could scale this up, how you could spread, or any, you know, methods we could actually engage those people who have some power to act, if that's necessary? Maybe it's not. Maybe that's not the way, or. Yeah.
No, I think it's a really good question. It's
or
not
the
something
urgency of time, basically,
yeah.
which we don't have. Like the next 5 years is crucial of what's happening with all of us. Like, and the refugee crisis is we will become refugees as well in Europe and in the US soon if we don't do something. So. Yeah,
I haven't focused that much on that because I've been so much interested in concentrating on this really kind of local idea, and I haven't really thought in any way how those sorts of, let's call them powers that be, who are kind of implementing all this kind of bulldozing would interface with this. I think it's a very big challenge right now, and I just don't have a good answer to say this is the way to do it. I think what I would say is that for all of the critique that we see about institutions and undermining our kind of confidence in the notion of an institution, actually our ability to kind of scale up the kind of activity that we do collectively as human beings comes somehow from building these kinds of institutions together, meaning that somehow we, you know, we need, I'm not going to answer this very, very well, but, you know, that idea of kind of building up, and I know the word institution means something very different in different contexts. What I'm talking about here is essentially organizational capacity that bridges people together to actually, you know, use each other's strength to start to confront that thing. That's a very kind of abstract way of saying it, but that's really the only thing that I've kind of thought of in that respect. I mean, on air quality, which I know is your issue, it's kind of significant that for all the work that that you or I or others have been involved in citizen-led air quality projects, actually the congestion charge probably had much more of an effect on the air quality of London. And so I'd like to think, though, that part of the congestion charge coming in was this kind of growing movement, this growing conversation, this kind of growing awareness about air quality as an issue. And so that is at least one possible way that one affects those sorts of larger decisions.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Usman. It has
Thanks
been
very much.
a wonderful lecture, as you have seen.
Thank you very much.